Alrighty then. I'm checking to see if I'm recording right off the bat this time. Yep. Okay, well, welcome to question and answer number 108. I am your host, Pannobhasa. And 108 is not only kind of a high number, but it's also kind of a sacred number, I guess, because a Burmese rosary or a Buddhist rosary or mala, I guess a Hindu one also, has 108 beads. So, if every Q&A was a bead, we'd be completing a rosary right now. And I've got like a mild hangover today, not from alcohol. I didn't have any alcohol last night. It's just that in the past also, sometimes if I've just been working really hard in like hot weather for the whole week, and it's been in the 90s all week here in upstate South Carolina, that sometimes I'll just have like this hangover on Saturday and won't be fully recovered until Sunday. And also, I'm like a human barometer in that it's been hot and dry all week, and then all of a sudden, like half an hour ago, it just started pouring down rain for the first time in many days. And sometimes I get kind of barometric-y too. But I trust that I will be able to answer your questions approximately as well as if I was feeling absolutely 100% chipper. So, got the beverage, in this case, bovine glandular secretions, and I should commence to answering questions. And the first question is from Siovak and Sipad Zidina. And Siovak and Sipad Zidina asked this question more than a week ago, but I didn't see the question, and this does happen sometimes. Some people think that they ask a question in good faith, and I don't answer it just because they might think that I consider their question to be unworthy or some such. But as a general rule, I answer even like silly questions. And so if I don't answer your question, it's probably because it somehow slipped through the cracks, or you asked it in an unusual position, in an unusual place. Like sometimes people will send me like an email with questions on it, and sometimes I just don't check my emails because usually I don't get questions there. And so I just go to the usual places, which is the comment sections under the videos and also the Discord server, also the subscribe star channel. Those are the main places where I look for questions. So if you have asked a question elsewhere and I didn't answer it, there's a good chance that if you do ask questions in future in the usual places, I will see it and will attempt to answer it. Whether I will answer that question to your satisfaction or not is an entirely different question. So anyways, because I skipped Siovak and Sipad Zidina last week, he asks more than 3 questions this time. He asked if he could ask 3 more because it's, 3 per week, sort of. But because he's Canadian, I only allowed him to answer 2 extra ones. So he's got 5 questions here. And I guess we should just wade right into these. So, Siovak and Sipad Zidina's first question is, I thought about it, and the "you're not killing the animal, so there's nothing wrong with it" argument for eating meat doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. By this logic, Buddhists can buy and sell CP. You know what I mean. That's what he says here. It's not technically breaking any precept since you aren't directly involved in the situation, just like with buying and selling meat instead of killing the animal. Thoughts? Well, I would say that if Siovak and Sipad Zidina really, he thinks that a standard Buddhist position really doesn't hold up to scrutiny, like with regard to Buddhist ethics, it may be that he is simply failing to see the point. Which does happen sometimes. So, Siovak and Sipad Zidina here is suggesting that it is actually immoral to eat meat. And again, whether something is moral or immoral depends more on your mental states than on the outward physical action. And so if you could eat something without unwholesome mental states, then you have done nothing wrong. So, let's see, he says, by this logic, Buddhists can buy and sell CP, in quote. It's not technically breaking any precept since you aren't directly involved in the situation, just like buying, selling meat. Yeah, but I mean, buying and selling certain kinds of pornography, I mean, it's not technically breaking any precept, but the whole porn mindset, I tried to say mindset and mind state at the same time. It's, from a Buddhist point of view, obviously unwholesome. Just eating food is not obviously unwholesome, but perving to pornography is, from a Buddhist point of view, clearly bad karma. So it's really not, it's not the same kind of a deal. So again, I mean, the Buddha probably ate meat. According to the text, he ate meat. He allowed the bhikkhus to eat meat. And if he considered it to be wrong, he probably would not have allowed it. And the allowance of monks to eat meat is even found in Mahayana texts, just buried in their rules of monastic discipline, where most Mahayana Buddhists don't look. So, I mean, technically buying and selling pornography, technically maybe it doesn't necessarily involve any unwholesome mental states. Let's say it's just like a code number on a screen. You're selling a bunch of other things and you don't know for sure what the person is buying. You're just seeing this multi-digit code, you know, the transaction occurs, and I mean, it's just sort of a bland, neutral kind of mental state. Then that would be very different from like being involved in the production of particularly pervy or extreme kinds of pornography. So, yeah, I really don't see that Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana has really like caught out Buddhism in some sort of like logical error here. That eating food is neither positive nor negative. It's just morally neutral so long as your mental states are morally neutral. Whereas, you know, like getting into the porn industry, even if you're not technically breaking a rule, I mean, there's a lot of really bad things you can do that aren't breaking a rule necessarily. That, I mean, it's just the mental states involved. So, I mean, if you cannot eat meat, and you might be hearing thunder crashing outside, but if you cannot eat meat without guilt or agitation, worry, that kind of a thing, then maybe you're better off being a vegetarian. But if you can eat meat and it's just eating nourishment, then, I mean, you might even be sending blessings to the animal that gave its life, you know, in gratitude, that sort of thing, then you're not necessarily doing anything wrong. So I guess I'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana's next question here, which is G.C. Pandey and Caroline Rhys Davids. I really don't know how to pronounce that name. Is it Rice Davids? Rhys Davids? Rhys Davids? I don't know. Let's just go with Rhys Davids. I'll start again. G.C. Pandey and Caroline Rhys Davids seem to have the exact opposite approach in a particular aspect when it comes to determining what texts are the oldest and which are the youngest. G.C. Pandey used the method of seeing one-off topics mentioned with little connection to orthodox views as probably being very early, as they were too different to be able to be removed. However, Caroline Rhys Davids said the oldest parts are probably the stock phrases used in various places around the texts, since these are attested all over and might be sayings of the Buddha his disciples actually memorized, and people might have added the context and stories around those stock phrases later on. Both of these arguments seem reasonable to me. However, I know you often cite G.C. Pandey, and I'm curious why you think the explanation of Caroline Rhys Davids is not compelling. Well, Caroline Rhys Davids is kind of an embarrassment to Buddhist studies. Maybe she's coming into vogue again because she was a woman and it's identity politics running amok nowadays, that sort of thing. But Caroline Rhys-Davids, first of all, as a translator, I mean, her translations pretty much suck. She had a very flowery, pretentious writing style. For example, the Therigatha, which literally means elders' verses, in her translated title is Psalms of the Brethren. And it's just this flowery, very pretentious translation style. And she really got into studying polytext because of her husband. And her husband, whose name I don't recall, his first name that is, his last name was Rhys-Davids. He was a much more reputable poly scholar. I mean, he was an early pioneer, but I think his wife does what a lot of wives do. She took an interest in what her husband was doing so they could spend more time together, share the same interests, that sort of thing. And really, she was sort of like a closet Christian. And so the stuff like no self, she just bashed away at that. She did not like that at all. She just considered it to be cooked up later by monkish philosophers. And she just had a very, I don't know, sort of intuitive, emotional kind of approach to understanding Dhamma. And deep down, she was not very Buddhist. So, then again, I mean, you can sort of put this to the test, the stuff that Siovak and Sipad Zidina is talking about. For example, there's a lot of evidence that the Attaka Wagga of the Sutta Nipata is one of the earliest Buddhist texts for various reasons. I've composed a list of just bits of evidence that the Attaka Wagga is very archaic Buddhism, possibly the largest chunk of very archaic Buddhism in existence. And it doesn't have any of these stock phrases. So, I mean, it could be that some of the stock phrases, certainly not all of them, but some of the stock phrases originated with the Buddha, and they just got plugged into sutta after sutta after sutta. But some of them, like the 12 links of Paticcasamuppada, which just gets plugged into sutta after sutta after sutta, is hardly likely to have originated with the Buddha himself. That there are signs of earlier versions of Paticcasamuppada or dependent co-arising, and it apparently underwent a kind of evolution until it finally crystallized in these 12 links. And I mean, also, some of the stock phrases that you find in the text are obviously very late and hardly likely to be authentic, like the conversion speech that non-Buddhists give when they get converted to Buddhism. You know, excellent Master Gotama, just as Master Gotama, someone would light, you know, they would turn right side up what had been upside down, or light a lamp in the darkness so that people can see forms, etc., etc. That is a common stock, I mean, just a stock block of words that just gets plugged into sutta after sutta after sutta, and that's obviously not original, and it's hardly likely. I mean, it could be that one person said that and it just got plugged into, you know, more than 100 suttas. But it's not a very good argument that Caroline Rhys-Davids uses. I mean, she is kind of an embarrassment to like early Buddhist studies. So yeah, I'm still going with G.C. Pandey. I mean, the very idea that you have an unorthodox teaching in the core text, in some relatively early body of texts in the Pali Tipitaka, and that it's just unorthodox. And it's only found like maybe once or twice, this idea is found maybe only once or twice in the texts. I mean, it's not necessarily originating with the Buddha himself, but it's pretty likely to be early. You know, stuff that's kind of an embarrassment is more likely to be authentic than stuff that's just blandly orthodox. For example, go with the New Testament. When Jesus is nailed up on the cross and he's crying out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" I mean, that gives some credence to the idea that maybe Jesus really did shout that when he was crucified, because why would God cry out, my God, why have you abandoned me? You could have an entire book, maybe it's already been written, of the various schools of Christianity trying to explain why Jesus would cry, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, when he's up on the cross. And that sort of thing holds true in Buddhism also. If it's something that's kind of embarrassing, something that's really looks like it shouldn't be there, I mean, it could be something really late and just really silly. That happens too. But like the fragment that is found in two different suttas about how consciousness, like infinite formless consciousness, unmanifest, shining all around, is like a definition of nibbana or a description of nibbana that, I mean, it's hardly likely to be post-orthodox. You know, it's not like after Orthodox Theravada got streamlined and established and formulated, that's not going to get added on after that. It's going to be during the formative phase when it gets added in, even if it didn't originate from the Buddha himself. It's going to be relatively early regardless, in all likelihood. But in conclusion, I would just like to say humbug on Caroline Rhys Davids. And so I'm just going to move on to Siovakchin Sipad Zidna's third question, which is, how can ignorance or papancha sanya sankha, depending on the specific list, occur before consciousness even arises in the dependent origination list in the momentary model of dependent origination? Well, again, that is assuming that it's supposed to be in a linear sequence. There was a famous English monk, Jnanavira, who pointed out that it says this arising, that arises. It doesn't say this ceasing, that arises. So ignorance or papancha sanya sankha, I can't remember exactly how I render that, papancha sanya sankha, which is differentiating perception of a name, something like that. It's papancha is like differentiation, sanya is perception, and sankha is like labeling, naming something, identifying something. And that in some early versions of dependent co-arising, like proto-paticca samuppada, that's how it all starts. That is how the whole samsara arises, is through this differentiating perception. So, ignorance sometimes occurs, let's see. How can ignorance or papancha sanya sankha occur before consciousness even arises? Well, the orthodox explanation is that you're dealing with 3 different lifetimes, like the standard 12 links of dependent co-arising. You got 3 lifetimes. You got the past lifetime or lifetimes, you've got the present lifetime, and then you've got future lifetimes or just the next life. So when it says consciousness, like vijnana, it's referring to rebirth linking consciousness. Because consciousness, according to Orthodox Theravada, can't arise before mental states. They have to arise simultaneously. But Siovakchin Sipad Zidna here is just assuming that it's a linear sequence of cause and effect, which it is not necessarily, and I don't think that dependent co-arising, it's that sam in samupada means together or with, and so it's co-arising, dependent co-arising, not this ceasing that arises. If this exists, that exists. That's how duality works, and that's how this world, this samsaric phenomenal universe arises, is through duality, which is a mental state. So, I mean, ignorance would be sort of like this primordial, it's like the foundation of samsara. Also, you can say papancha is like the primordial foundation of samsara, even though there really was no beginning. It's just, that's sort of like the essence of it. Ignorance is the essence of this world, or differentiation and perception are the essence of this world. Sort of like Schopenhauer, the world as will and representation. If you were to translate that into Pali jargon, it would be samsara as, samsara as Chaitanya and Sanya. The world as will and perception. So I guess I answered that question. So I'll just move on to the next one here. Also from Siovaction Sipad Zirna, who asked 5 questions because I skipped him last time accidentally. It wasn't on purpose because he's Canadian. So he says, please do an analysis of Bhikkhu Nyanamoli's interpretation of this sutta where he attempts to explain the luminous unbound mind. Do you agree with what he says, or do you have disagreements? First of all, I would point out that Bhikkhu Nyanamoli is the new, current, famous Nyanamoli, and not the previous famous Nyanamoli who translated like the Visuddhimagga and a number of other relatively obscure Theravadan philosophical texts. And the new Nyanamoli, I believe he is Slavic. He lives in Europe. Let's see here. So there's a statement, and this is like one of those statements you find in the text that is probably relatively old. It's like pre-Orthodox. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in there. And let's see. Pabasaramidam bhikkhue chitam tancha ko agantuke hi upakilese hi upakilitam tam asutawa putujano yatabhutam napajanadi dasama asutawa putujanasa cheta bhavana nati di vadami di. So this is the verse or the quote that Bhikkhu Nyanamoli, he has like done a commentary on. And let's see, for my translation would be something like, let's see, monks, this mind is shining forth, but it is defiled by extraneous defilements. And then let's see, thus for the unlearned common person, the unlearned common person does not understand this as it truly is, and therefore I say there is no mental development for the unlearned common person. So I think Bhikkhu Nyanamoli's explanation is similar to mine. I think we're pretty much in agreement on this. He says that this mind is shining forth, that our like consciousness is shining forth, and Bhikkhu Nyanamoli interprets that to mean infinite. He says like the structure of mind, like the basic structure of mind is infinite, which I mean is, if it's really infinite, it would be formless, and so I'm not sure how there would be structure. So I would use different words than him, I think, but he is saying that ultimately consciousness is just infinite and formless. And I would agree with that. And then he says, it's like, I can't remember the word he uses that I translated as extraneous. The Pali word is aganduke heat. And aganduke heat means like coming. Like aganduka is like a visitor or a newcomer in like the rules of monastic discipline. So it's like our defilements, our mind is pure and infinite, and it is defiled by defilements that are not of the nature of this infinite mind. It's just coming from like extraneous to that, coming from outside somehow. And in the earliest texts like the Atthakavagga, thoughts or mental states are considered to be something extraneous, something outside, something that comes from outside, which is a little difficult for a lot of Western, followers of scientism to really grasp, but it is a profound idea that even your own thoughts are not you. Your own thoughts are just extraneous. So, yeah, I mean, he doesn't interpret Pabbasaram as shining forth. Literally, that's what it means, is shining forth. He points out that the word akasa, which means space usually, also literally means shining forth. I guess, I mean, technically it would be shining towards oneself if it has the prefix of a long A, but still, there's a shininess involved in the word for space, and so Bhikkhu Nyanamoli has interpreted this Pabhasaram, this mind is shining forth, as this mind is infinite like space. Either one works. Like the verse that is mentioned in the article that I've already mentioned about how the mind is like infinite, formless, unmanifest, and shining all around. So that's got shininess and infiniteness combined. So either way is fine, I think. Really, the really profound part for me, the kind of mind-blowing part, aside from the essence of consciousness is infinite, is that, you know, our own defilements, our own like deluded thoughts and so forth are not that. You know, they're extraneous to the purity of consciousness. And then, of course, the last two lines are insulting lay Buddhists to some degree, where it's saying there's like lay Buddhists don't understand this about the mind and how it is defiled, and so they make no progress. They got no mental development. Anyone who doesn't really understand that, according to this, what this quote is implying, you know, anyone who doesn't really understand that consciousness is infinite and luminous, and then it just kind of gets like made dirty and impure through extraneous mental states, extraneous defilements covering it up. That people who don't get that don't make progress. So that's kind of controversial, because it's not really an orthodox idea. And so most orthodox, like Ajahns and Sayadaws, probably don't believe this. Probably fewer Sayadaws than Ajahns, because the Ajahns aren't as dogmatic. And there is a movement in like a philosophical, I guess you'd call it a movement, just an idea in Thailand that really the mind is kind of, you know, it abides beyond the mere human. That is essentially like, I mean, almost like God or Tao or Brahman or something. But for the most part, yeah, I do agree with Bhikkhu Nyanamoli's interpretation. And so I'm going to move on to Siyovakshan Sipad Zirina's next question, which is an easy one for me to answer. He said, you mentioned Bhikkhu Nyanananda's book in your last video. I found that his lectures in the book, The Mind Stilled, goes over the suttas to look at almost every occurrence of Nibbana to come to an explanation that is non-orthodox to Theravada, is even more controversial than his book, Concept and Reality. Have you read this? And if so, what are your thoughts on it? I've heard about it, but I haven't read it, so I can't really give my thoughts on it. Apparently, it was too controversial to have been accepted by mainstream Theravada Buddhist scholarship. Like I said in the previous Q&A, his book, Concept and Reality, gives such a, you know, really a strong argument, such a strong argument that the commentarial tradition is wrong on a certain point, that pretty much all Theravada Buddhist scholars accept his interpretation of the meaning of the word papancha now, except probably for some very dogmatic, conservative types of monks who mostly are living in Asia. So I think Bhikkhu Nyanananda was Sinhalese, if I'm not mistaken. So that's it for Siyovakshan Sipad Zirina's 5 questions. So the next question is from Raphael, and his questions also, they were right after Siyovakshan Sipad Zirina's questions on the scroll, and I didn't scroll up high enough. I scrolled up to the Q&A that was previous to the one. I don't know how to explain this. I'm having difficulties explaining things sometimes lately. So anyways, I missed his questions too. So anyways, Raphael's first question here. Have you ever met people who told you that semen retention was beneficial for them? Well, back when I was writing my first blog, there was an Indian fellow who was sort of sporadically obsessed with this issue, and he would bring it up a lot. He had a website just on this issue. Sometimes he would kind of lose interest, I guess, or fall off the wagon, but then he'd just get right back on it again. How semen retention is beneficial, if not necessary, for deep spiritual development. But it never really worked for me, because back when I was younger, I mean, there wasn't much retention, because every 2 weeks I'd just have like a nocturnal emission. I'd have some pornographic dream or something, and it was not retained. So yeah, I'm sure there are people. I mean, obviously, a lot of Buddhists, especially Buddhist monks, are of the opinion that celibacy is beneficial for them, and celibacy for a monk involves not spanking the puppy. So you don't have that as a kind of pressure relief valve. But yeah, there have been a few people, and they tend to be obsessive about it. That, you know, they just have this idea that if you have an orgasm, especially if you have one on purpose, that, I mean, your spiritual practice has just nosedived, or, you know, you're just a hopeless case or something. But I wouldn't go so far as that. That celibacy, it is a good method for people who are capable of being celibate without just being like chronically horny all the time. Like a starving man thinking only of food. There are a lot of horny celibates out there who are just thinking about sex all the time because they're not getting any. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to Raphael's next question, which is your thoughts on Dogen and his Soto Shu. Well, I did read Dogen's most famous book back when I was in college, and I've forgotten almost all of it, except for this one weird scene where there was a monk who was eating meat. It might have even been raw meat, and like drinking raw blood. And so Dogen goes to his room and looks in on him and sees that there's a demon sitting on top of his head that's actually eating the meat. So that's like all I retain from reading Dogen's most famous book back when I was about 19 years old. With regard to Soto Shu, before I was converted to Theravada, I was planning sort of tentatively to become a Soto Zen monk. And one reason why I preferred Soto Zen to Rinzai Zen is I wasn't much into koans at the time. Later, I've come to acquire an appreciation for koans, but Soto Zen has less emphasis on koans and more emphasis on something like shikantaza, which is a really powerful meditation practice. So my thoughts on Dogen, I really can't remember enough about him to have many thoughts, other than that, you know, he's reputed to be the founder of Soto Zen in Japan. And Soto Zen was one of the two main branches of Zen in Japan, Rinzai and Soto. Rinzai was called Samurai Zen, and Soto was called like Peasant Zen or Farmer Zen, because it was simpler and had fewer aristocrats following it, I guess. But I was tentatively planning on becoming a Soto Zen monk at one time, but obviously it didn't happen that way. So I'm going to move on to Raphael's next question, which is, what would the Buddha have done with monks who repeatedly traded in money? Since this is not a parajika offense, he could not have expelled them from the Sangha. Well, I mean, there's other ways of dealing with monks who just continually break rules. I mean, you can do formal acts of the Sangha, formal acts of censure, formal acts of like, you can just banish them, you know, just say you can't stay here anymore. You can do, one of the most serious ones is a formal act of suspension from the Sangha, which, I mean, it's not defrocking him. He's still a monk, but he's not a monk in good standing, and he is not allowed to live with other monks, speak with other monks, bow or get bowed to with other monks, anything like that. He's just like ostracized. He's not excommunicated, but he's pretty much like kicked out of any group of monks, any sangha in good standing. Also, there's one punishment called the Brahmadanda, the divine punishment, which is similar to that, where you're just not allowed to have anything to do with this monk. So there's a good chance that the Buddha would have done that. First of all, the Buddha himself, if what we read in the text is reliable, first of all, the Buddha would just be admonishing and scolding these monks. And being scolded by a fully enlightened Buddha is probably pretty powerful experience. It's going to be more persuasive than just getting scolded by some random person. So, yeah, probably the Buddha would admonish them, then probably scold them, and then maybe have some formal act of the Sangha or the Brahmadanda imposed upon them, just to, like, sort of quarantine them as much as possible. So I suppose I answered that question, so I'm moving on to the next one, which is from Kevin. And Kevin says, are the weird little things in your aquarium considered to be sentient beings? Well, certainly they are considered to be sentient beings, and I think the fish, at least, would qualify as a low-level kind of sentient being. Like sentient in the sense of having an actual, like, images in your mind. Sort of like a mental panorama, sort of images. This sort of conscious experience in the human sense, in a way. Of course, a fish wouldn't have conscious experience in the human sense, but it would have just this tiny glimmer of that. But the other creatures in my aquarium, and I'm excited to announce, I got 8 shrimp and I put in there today. They're Neocaridina davidi, a blue variety. And of course, I'm digressing shamelessly at this point, but of course, within the first 10-15 minutes, they all just hid. So they're all like under dead leaves and like under rocks and so forth in my aquarium. And so I'm hoping that I'll get to see them sometimes, because this has already happened to me before. When I first got fish and put it in the aquarium, I got 2 coolie loaches, which look like little eels, little stripy eels. I put them in there, and I've seen one of them in the past month. That was like 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago at this point. His head was sticking out from under a rock, and that was it. That's all I saw. That's all I've seen of those 2 fish that are supposedly in there. I don't know if they're even alive anymore. There's a guy named Forrest Galante who had a TV show where he's a biologist, and he goes out in search of animals that are considered to be extinct. Sometimes he finds them. Sometimes he thinks, well, okay, these ones really are extinct. But sometimes he finds them. And I've been seriously considering just trying to contact this guy, having him come here and find out if my coolie loaches are still in there, because, I don't see them. And the shrimp just promptly disappeared into the derbis on the bottom of the aquarium too. But there is one glimmery bright side from that, in that I have inoculated this aquarium with amphipod crustaceans also. So now I've got decapod crustaceans, which include the shrimp, amphipods, they're called scuds. Aquarium keepers call them scuds. They might be in there too, and I'm just not seeing them because they're always hiding, which is kind of a bummer. But to have them in there and not see them is better than not having them in there at all. It's just the thing is, you don't know for sure if they're in there because you don't see the little bastards. But getting back to Kevin's question, would shrimp be considered sentient beings? Orthodox Buddhism would consider a shrimp to be a sentient being. But, I have a degree in biology, and I'm doubtful whether a little shrimp, it's like half an inch long, really has any kind of like mental images in its mind. It could be like insects, for example. They're just like little terminators, like little robots. Their whole nervous system is designed very differently from the nervous system of a human being or a fish. they don't really have a central nervous system. And so it could be that, they'll move away from danger, but that could just be like the automatic door at the grocery store just moving out of your way when, the sensors sense that you're coming towards it. It could be that kind of a deal. I'm not saying that they don't have any consciousness at all, because, I think maybe even a hydrogen atom has this little primordial spark of consciousness. I'm just saying that, in my opinion, it is doubtful whether or not they are sentient, because that's different from just being conscious, at least by my reckoning. So, the little creatures that live in that aquarium, which might include like copepods or little rotifers or like paramecium, like protozoans. Where do you draw the line between sentient and non-sentient? Where do you draw the line between having some kind of psychology and not having any psychology, where it's all just behavioral manifestations of neurophysiology? So, that's really a question I can't answer. From the Buddhist point of view, they are considered to be sentient beings. But from like a modern biological point of view, just where do you draw the line between sentient and non-sentient? Having like a mind that perceives and just not really having a mind, but just being like an automaton. I really can't answer that question. I don't know where exactly you would draw the line. Different people would draw the line at different places. Of course, a lot of religious people would just draw the line at humans. Like, only humans have a conscious mind. Even a dog doesn't have a conscious mind. Rene Descartes, supposedly the founder of Western philosophy, modern Western philosophy, he believed that. He believed only humans have a mind, and that animals, like even dogs, probably even chimpanzees, do not have a mind, because presumably they don't have a soul or some such. And Cartesian philosophers would publicly torture animals just as a way of demonstrating their conviction that that dog that's screaming and howling and crying and trying to get away is just an automaton that doesn't feel anything. So that's a little more blatant digression there. Let's see. Yeah, they are considered to be sentient beings, but whether all of them, is an amoeba crawling around in the sand? Is that sentient? I don't know. A nematode worm, maybe? It's hard to say. I think that even the sand probably has some glimmer of consciousness, but it doesn't think. It doesn't perceive anything. It's just this primordial little spark. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Athena's Sigil. And Athena's Sigil says, why does Western Buddhism have so many leftist adherents? Most Asian cultures are very conservative. This is still Athena's Sigil saying this. Most Asian cultures are very conservative, as are the teachings and values of most Eastern Buddhist sects, whether Mahayana or Theravada. Even when I was a young lefty lad and still quite fascinated by Buddhism, I instinctively and through my observations knew it was a very conservative and patriarchal faith, yet as soon as it westernized, it ignored all that and became everything it wasn't. Looking forward to your answer. Well, hey, stop it. We got dogs in heat again. Okay, let's see here. So the main question here, why does Western Buddhism have so many leftist adherents? And it's fairly easy to answer. It is true that in like a country like Burma, the conservatives are the Buddhists because they are traditionalists. They're following their national tradition, which is what conservatives do. They are conserving their national traditions. Whereas in the West, most conservatives are going to be Christians or maybe Jews. So it's the people who are rejecting tradition to some degree that are converting to Buddhism. So that's one of the main reasons why most Western Buddhists are leftists, is that if they were conservative traditionalists, there's a good chance they'd be going to church as Christians. Also, partly as a symptom of this, Buddhism became popular in the West. I think originally it became popular among like European Westerners, Westerners of European ancestry during the Beat movement of like the 1950s and early 60s. People like Gary Snyder, he was a practicing Zen Buddhist. He'd go to Japan to do sessions in Japan. And then the hippies kind of converted over to Hinduism more. But I mean, it was still like this leftist, anti-traditionalist kind of attitude. Like the boomers, I mean, they were just rebelling against their parents. So if their parents were conservative Christians, they'd just do anything except be a conservative Christian. So, yeah, the main reason why Western Buddhism has so many leftist adherents is because Buddhism is not traditional to the West, and conservatism is like traditionalism. And so conservatives in the West are Christians or Jews, and for the most part, and conservatives in Burma would be Theravada Buddhists, and it's like the leftists in Burma would probably convert to Christianity or just become atheists, followers of scientism. So that's why. And so I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, if cultivating a good karma in this life will take me to heaven in the next life, does it mean that it will be even more difficult to attain nirvana? I learned from Mahayana Tibetan teachers that the human realm is the best realm to attain nirvana. Yeah, they say the same thing in Theravada, that a human birth is the best kind of birth to get for the purpose of making progress in Dhamma. And that's mainly because in the hell realms, the lower realms, animal realm, hell realms, ghosts, that kind of a thing, you're too ignorant and in many cases too afflicted, too concerned with just surviving to really spend much time thinking about philosophy or higher things, or just trying to become enlightened, that sort of thing. You're mainly just in survival mode or just total affliction mode. Whereas the heaven realms, things are so nice there that the beings in these heaven realms are less motivated to try and find a way out or to try to improve their situation, because they've already got no sickness, no headaches, no hunger, anything like that. No old age, really. And so everything's fine up there. So they're just kind of satisfied with that. So let's see here. What is the question again? Oh, if Cleefy does good karma in this life, will it take him to heaven in the next life? And does that mean it will be even more difficult to attain nirvana? It's possible, although some devas can still make spiritual attainments. So, I mean, you shouldn't try to avoid heaven unless you're just trying to avoid rebirth in general. I mean, you're much better off in heaven than in hell. So, there is a good chance that by doing a lot of merit, you'll be reborn in a really good position to practice Dhamma as a human. So, I mean, if you're very Dhamma oriented, then you're probably going to have more dharmic karma in your next life, which may very well mean that you're going to be reborn in a wisdom culture, and that, I mean, you'll be better set up for practicing Dhamma and cultivating wisdom. So, I mean, if you're just doing good karma that's sort of a worldly good karma, then you might be more likely to go to heaven. But if you're cultivating good karma in the sense of cultivating, deep meditative states and so forth, then there's a good chance you'll be reborn where you can continue to make progress, because that's the momentum of your mind. That's the direction your karma is going. So you really shouldn't worry about this kind of stuff. Just do good without really like labeling it as doing good. You know, you shouldn't be a spiritual materialist and just consider merit to be a kind of like metaphysical money. Just do good without really having an idea of doing good. And that's sort of the way a bodhisattva is supposed to act. You know, he always does good, but he's not thinking, I'm doing good. He's not dividing up good between good and bad, starting a duality in that sense. It's just everyday life is just, that's what he does. That's just the way it is. And that is the wisest way to go about it. I mean, the Buddha would not encourage people to do good and earn merit, lay people especially, if he didn't think it would be good for them. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from someone whose name looks like Kriel, but apparently it is pronounced Throat Warbler Mangrove. And Throat Warbler Mangrove says, what would you do if you had definite proof that the Buddha never actually existed and his religion was merely the fabrication of men? By the way, I do not believe the Buddha never existed. I do not believe he existed either, but I highly suspect he did. Well, okay, so what would I do if I had somehow had proof that the Buddha never actually existed? Well, I mean, I don't have proof that I exist. I mean, seriously, I mean, I'm such a skeptic in certain ways that I don't think that there is any way to really prove anything in the outside world. I mean, that's like Spinoza and David Hume are both famous for having pointed this out, that with regard to anything out there, with regard to the phenomenal world, you can't really prove anything. So like Spinoza was saying, and maybe it was David Hume, that something that's entirely internal to your mind, like a theorem of Euclid or something, you know, some mathematical problem, maybe like a theoretical chess problem, you can work it out in your mind and prove that. But with regard to knowing what's going on outside your mind, you can't really be sure. So anyway, that's just sort of a quibble there. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I somehow had definite proof of one thing, and that is that the Buddha never actually existed and his religion was merely the fabrication of men. Well, I mean, even if the Buddha did exist, his religion was the fabrication of men, because the Buddha was a man and all of Buddhism wasn't fabricated by him. There's all sorts of other men, presumably a lot of them unenlightened, who participated in the formulation of Buddhism. So, I mean, it wouldn't be that much of a difference. And also, if you consider some other system like Hinduism, like the Bhagavad Gita, for example, I mean, it's hardly likely that Krishna, as portrayed in Hindu texts, really existed. You know, that Hinduism didn't have just one enlightened founder. It just sort of evolved over the centuries, over the millennia. And still, I assume that if it's possible to become enlightened in this world, there are enlightened Hindus. So, I mean, it might change the way I go about understanding Buddhism a little bit in subtle ways, but I don't think it would be that much of a change. I mean, did the Buddha really exist? I mean, if you asked him that, he might say, you know, it's like, nobody can know that. I think there is a statement in the Pali text, like someone is asking if a Buddha exists after death, and he's saying, I mean, does he even exist before death? You know, how can you know? But that's sort of a quibble also. I'm quibbling big time. So, yeah, I mean, if the Buddha didn't really exist, I'd have to look at Buddhism sort of the way I would look at Hinduism, which didn't have like one single enlightened founder. There were a lot of people contributing to Hinduism. Some of them may be enlightened and most of them probably not, which is similar situation to Buddhism. But like the Bhagavad Gita, I really do not think the Bhagavad Gita is like a transcript of statements made by Krishna to Arjuna on the field of battle as they're mounted on their chariot. But Bhagavad Gita is still a profound text, has a lot of profundity to it. So, yeah, in answer to Throat Warbler Mangrove's question, I just have to say, I don't think it would really, it'd be kind of disappointing. I might be a little disillusioned and sad, but still, even if the Buddha wasn't enlightened, his system has almost certainly produced enlightened Buddhists. So even if the Buddha didn't really exist, still there's plenty of enlightened beings, which technically would be Buddhas, because Buddha literally means enlightened or awakened. If you could prove that nobody's ever become enlightened, that the Buddha wasn't enlightened and nobody else is ever enlightened, that nobody can ever possibly become enlightened, if you could just prove that, that would be the ultimate black pill, I think. But I don't think anyone's going to prove that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, are you familiar with Alan Watts? If so, what is your impression of him and his work? Well, my familiarity with Alan Watts is very limited. When I was in Burma, I found in Don Oway bookstore a book by Alan Watts. I think it was just simply entitled Zen Buddhism. And I read it. And he's eloquent. He's a good writer. He's intelligent. He seems to understand the subject matter fairly well. I've heard insinuations that in his private life, he was like an alcoholic and some kind of, naughty person or something. But I really don't know much about that. I think I've heard one or two of his talks on YouTube. He was like a guidance counselor at a university or something like that. That's how he made most of his money, I guess. I really don't know that much about him. Like I say, I've read at least one book by him, and it's intelligent, well-written book. But what he would be like personally, I can't say. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's next question. And he said, in Q&A number 106, you mentioned that you were from Aberdeen, Washington, which is also the hometown of rock legend Kurt Cobain of Nirvana fame. I was wondering if you had any experiences that you can recount of growing up in the same town as Kurt Cobain and or living in that general area during the rise of grunge music in the late 80s and early 90s. Did you know anyone connected to Kurt Cobain or in the budding grunge scene in general? Incidentally, what is your impression of alternative rock music from either 90s grunge or before? And then he's got this little, like a footnote kind of saying, you don't have to name all of these on your Q&A, but I'm referring to classic alternative music from bands like Lou Reed, Velvet Underground, Elvis Costello, Talking Heads, The Ramones, The Clash, REM, Red Hot Chili Peppers, The Smiths, The Cure, Pixies, Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins, etc. Not anything past the 90s. Okay. Well, actually, Kurt Cobain and I went to the same high school. But when I was a senior, he was just like this lowly, like a freshman or a sophomore. I'd never heard of him. I might have seen him in the halls, and it just didn't register because he was just a pathetic little nobody at the time. So, but kind of strange, the first time I ever heard of Kurt Cobain, I was a young monk living in Burma, and I happened to meet this guy from Alaska. And when he found out where I was from, he said, oh, Kurt Cobain just died. So I didn't even hear about the existence of Kurt Cobain until after he had already died, which is kind of strange. But there we are. So, yeah, I have no experiences of growing up in the same town as Kurt Cobain. I've got a lot of experiences growing up in the same town as him. And we played in the same sunshine when we were kids. But, I didn't know who Kurt Cobain was. Even when we were at the same high school, I didn't know who he was. So I mean, I do remember the rise of grunge music. It wasn't called grunge then at the time. The two main bands that I remember being played on the campus radio station when I was in college and afterwards, no, it was after I was in college, still living in the town that I went to university at, was Soundgarden, which you still hear on the radio sometimes, and Green River, which apparently faded into obscurity. So let's see. I mean, I might as well mention this. It's not really part of what Romeo was asking about, but it turns out that my stepbrother was relatively famous in a relatively famous band, and that is my stepbrother is Kurt Vanderhoof, my ex stepbrother, and he was like lead guitar player for a band called Metal Church, and I'm sure you could find it on YouTube. Metal Church. I think they actually rejoined. They got back together, started producing music again after a few decades, partly because now in this age of pirating and YouTube and so forth, it's really hard to make money from selling records, selling albums. And so the only way to really make money as a musician is to do live performances, apparently, unless you got some kind of angle worked out. So yeah, Kurt Vanderhoof of Metal Church fame, on the first album cover of their Metal Church debut album, he thanked his mother, Jerry Reynolds, who was my stepmother. So I think I've answered most of that. Although he's also he's referring to the classic alternative music from bands like Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, which, I mean, Lou Reed did a solo album in the 80s that a friend of mine had the CD or whatever, and we listened to it, and it was an interesting album. Elvis Costello, I kind of liked Elvis Costello. Talking Heads was one of my favorite bands when I was in high school and in college. I remember I got introduced to Talking Heads. I went to DJ Sound City in Aberdeen, not the South Shore Mall, the Wishcom Mall. And I'm just looking through the rock and roll section, and I see this album that's just black, textured like some kind of industrial footplate kind of a thing. And the names of the songs were just intriguing, like Paper, Air, Electric Guitar, Drugs, that kind of a thing. So I just thought, and I didn't know what they sounded like. I just bought the tape, and I'm listening to it when I'm driving home. The first song is E Zimbra, which has just gibberish lyrics. The lyrics don't mean anything. And I'm thinking, oh man, what did I buy? Because it's just kind of like a weird song. But by the time you got to the last song on side 2, which is called Drugs, I mean, I was just cackling like a fiend. It was magnificent. And I do think that Talking Heads Remain in Light. I mean, the tape that I was referring to is Fear of Music. But their next album after that, Remain in Light, I consider to be their zenith. And they started going downhill after Remain in Light. Their next album after Remain in Light was still pretty good, but then it's like everything sucked after that, or at least in my opinion it did. It's just not listenable. But like their first 4 or 5 albums, I was really into them. The Clash, I mean, everybody had combat rock in those days. REM never made much of an impression on me. Red Hot Chili Peppers, I never really liked all that much. There's a few songs that they still play on the radio that are listenable. The Smiths and The Cure were after my time pretty much. I mean, the Smiths were already making music, but I never really listened to it much. Although my lovely mate, my woman, was heavily into The Cure especially, and also the Smiths. She was like a goth chick in her younger years. The Pixies, the only song I even know of by the Pixies is the song at the very end of Fight Club. Well, the guy with no name and his girlfriend Marla are holding hands watching the buildings blow up. But it's a good song. I've got it on my computer. So, yeah, I mean, the 90s, I pretty much missed out on 90s music. I was listening to music up until the late 80s, and then I entered a monastery, and then I went to Burma. And so it wasn't until after I came back to America that I'm finally like discovering bands like Enigma or the Black Keys, or let's see, Dead Can Dance. That's pretty alternative. What else? There's a few other ones that are The Offspring. I really like The Offspring. They're one of my favorite bands that I missed out on totally while I was living in Burma. So, yeah, I do like rock and roll, and I do like classic alternative music. I never really considered like Talking Heads to be classic alternative music. I mean, that was more like new wave, it seems to me. Classic alternative music would be more like King Crimson or something. Although King Crimson did do an album imitating Talking Heads' style, so there is that. So anyways, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from somebody whose name I cannot pronounce. It's Dualiatipo. I don't know what Dualiatipo signifies, but I assume they got teased a lot as kids with a name like that. And Dualiatipo says, Pannobhasa said, too much compassion pretty much destroys Darwinian survival of the fittest and pretty much destroys any kind of positive direction of evolution, which leads to 3 questions. 1, if Darwinism is real, why should we seek enlightenment since we are all evolving to it one way or another? Well, that's a misunderstanding of Darwinism or evolution in general, at least organic evolution. There may be different kinds of evolution, but organic evolution really isn't evolving towards enlightenment. In fact, enlightenment may never evolve as just like the status quo for a species, because it would probably be against, now it would decrease your odds of survival. You know, if you have no greed or hate or lust, anything like that, you're less likely to reproduce your DNA sequences. So what Darwinian evolution is striving towards blindly through trial and error, really, and just, you know, whatever works, just scattershot, and whatever works just it continues. I mean, that's more towards survival, like reproducing your DNA sequences. You survive long enough to make babies. So it's the organisms that are best at surviving long enough to make babies, preferably in such a way that their babies survive long enough to make babies. Those are the ones that are evolutionary successes. And I don't think an arahant would really fit that category. Arahants are evolutionary dead ends. Celibate people in general are evolutionary dead ends. So, yeah, we're not evolving towards enlightenment. We're just evolving towards greater adaptation to the environment. And yeah, I don't think enlightenment's ever really going to fit into that equation. So, I mean, enlightenment is just bailing out of the system. And you start off as a general rule by being an evolutionary dead end. Jesus, assuming that he existed, apparently was an evolutionary dead end. Gautama Buddha was an evolutionary dead end since he had one son, but then ordained him so that he became a celibate arahant. There you go. No more of the Buddha's DNA sequences are existing except through distant ancestors or like not very close relatives. So let's see here. I guess I answered that one. So the next question on the theme of evolution is, if so, are we evolving just to evolve, or are we evolving towards enlightenment? Well, I think I pretty much already answered that. We're evolving towards greater adaptation to the environment so that we are more successful at surviving and making babies. So in a way, we are evolving just to evolve. We're evolving because it can, or at least that is the mechanistic Darwinian mainstream scientific explanation for evolution, although I'm open to the idea, and I wouldn't at all be surprised if there's like a higher force, you know, some kind of spiritual force also participating in evolution, sort of like Schopenhauer's will. Or, I mean, it could be that there's like this consciousness that is in a way sort of like in Arthur C. Clarke in 2001: A Space Odyssey, where you have like this alien entity or group of entities that are just promoting the advancement of intelligence throughout the universe, that kind of a thing. So there might be some sort of spiritual aspect of evolution, but I still don't think that it's evolving towards enlightenment. It's just evolving towards filling in all these niches and just becoming whatever it can become, sort of like the way Schopenhauer's will operates. So I think I'll just move on to Dual Yatipo's third question, which is this difference in end goals a conflict between Darwinism and Buddhism? It's not really a conflict because, I mean, it's just apples and oranges. It's just, it's like, is Buddhism in conflict with Euclidean geometry? Well, no, because, they're just in different spheres, in different realms. So, I mean, Darwinism kind of, to some degree, it can complement Buddhism. I mean, I've combined Darwinism and Buddhism in my understanding of reality, like just understanding that a human being is a species of animal and that we still have lots of animal instincts. That is something that, for me anyway, has been very helpful in allowing me to understand myself and understand human beings in general. That we're a kind of upgraded ape, and we still have a lot of these primordial instincts that our distant ancestors had. So in that sense, I mean, they're not in conflict at all. I mean, how can one thing that's true be in conflict with another thing that's true? Although, I mean, Darwinism is just samsaric. It's like organic evolution is a samsaric phenomenon. So ultimately, Buddhism, you're going to be getting off the wheel. You're going to stop evolving. You're going to be bailing out sideways. Which reminds me of Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Roman Catholic philosopher who was talking about like spiritual evolution. And he was referring, and he just made this one comment that apparently was referring to Buddhism, where he's saying that some people or some beings may not evolve all the way up towards godhood, that they might just bail out sideways long before you get anywhere near the ultimate. And that's sort of like what Buddhism does, or maybe like something that like J. Krishnamurti teaches. It's like you're never going to reach the end of the path. The path has no end. You just keep going and going and going. And so eventually you just bail out sideways. So anyways, the last question here, is this difference in end goals a conflict between Darwinism and Buddhism? I mean, the end goal of Darwinism or of organic evolution is just greater adaptation to the environment so that one survives and reproduces more effectively. And Buddhism is you're just abandoning samsara, just transcending it and merging with the infinite luminous mind, so to speak. So, yeah, it's not really a conflict, I think. It shouldn't be a conflict. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Kzen. And Kzen says, Jesus was most likely an enlightened person who was persecuted, humiliated, and finally crucified. To do such a thing to an enlightened being is the heaviest of sins. Is the weight of this act seemingly responsible for the persistent persecution since of those involved? Well, like I mentioned in the previous Q&A, I've actually taken some heat for assuming that Jesus even existed as a historical person. But let's, just for the sake of argument, assume that Jesus really existed. Going with Orthodox Theravada, he wouldn't be an enlightened person because, for example, Jesus got angry sometimes. He wept. The shortest verse of the New Testament is Jesus wept. And from the point of view of Orthodox Theravada, an enlightened being would not weep. But even if he wasn't fully enlightened, and I mean, just because Orthodox Theravada says an enlightened being cannot weep doesn't mean that an enlightened being really cannot weep. Maybe enlightened beings really can weep. Neem Karoli Baba up on the altar back there, he wept sometimes. He laughed, he roared, he just did all kinds of stuff that enlightened beings aren't supposed to do. But he was just like a spiritual Superman as far as I'm concerned. So Jesus was a very great, wise person, a saint, even whether or not he was fully enlightened, whether or not full enlightenment even means anything in a samsaric context. And then he was persecuted, humiliated, finally crucified. To do such things to an enlightened being or a great saint is the heaviest of sins. So is the weight of this act seemingly responsible for the persistent persecution since of those involved? Well, I haven't really heard of much persistent persecution since of the Roman government, because I guess it was the Roman government that had Jesus put to death. As I understand it, assuming that Jesus really existed, Jesus was executed by the Roman government on political charges. I mean, it wasn't that he was claiming to be the son of God, or the other people were claiming that he was the son of some mad god of the Jews. The Romans really didn't care about that. But when he's being called King of the Jews, and according to the Gospel, according to Mark, that was the sign mounted on top of his crucifix, the King of the Jews. I mean, the Romans would not tolerate a political rival. If he's being called King of the Jews, and the Jews were just continually like revolting. I almost didn't want to say revolting because it could be misconstrued in a different context, but they were like continually just rebelling and just making trouble and rioting and massacring and getting massacred. And just, I mean, they could not accept that they were not the greatest nation on earth, that Rome conquered them and they were a subject state, and they just couldn't stand that. And where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so the Jesus suddenly being called the king of these people, yeah, the Roman government was not going to tolerate that. But then you read the New Testament that it was like the Pharisees of the Sanhedrin who wanted to get rid of him, and so they like turned him into the feds essentially, and then the Roman government had him executed. But it could be that the authors of the New Testament were deliberately trying to make the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin look bad. So it could be there's some propaganda in there. And it shouldn't be too surprising, since just look at all the propaganda we have lately. But just getting back to the idea that somebody tortured Jesus of Nazareth to death, assuming that he ever existed. I think he probably did, but there's people out there who think that that's just nonsense, that he couldn't possibly have existed. Yeah, I mean, the people who actually did, like convicting him, insisting that he be killed, and then of course, the Roman soldiers who are nailing him to this crucifix. And I mean, I've read about how it works. It's really an awful way of dying, being crucified. And according to Will Durant, the historian, he said that when you're crucified, you're hung with your arms outstretched like this, which causes just incredible like leverage and tension on your chest, which eventually causes your heart to stop. So yeah, I mean, just the people who actually were involved, but karma does not it doesn't latch onto an entire ethnicity for 2,000 years. It's like even the Bible says, I mean, you're not punished for the sins of your fathers. And karma is even more so that way. You may be able to find evidence that God just decides to smite somebody because his dad was a shit. Just wipes out the whole family just to punish one person, that kind of a thing. But in Buddhism, I mean, your karma is your own. Kamasako is just a common saying in Pali, which means your karma is your own. So it's the people who actually were participating in the torturing and the killing and all that. Those people were making very bad karma. But like their distant like descendants over 1,000 years later, I mean, if they're reading the New Testament and cheering on the Roman soldiers, that kind of thing, like in A Clockwork Orange, where little Alex is like fantasizing about being one of the Roman soldiers who kills Jesus, then yeah, you can get bad karma for that too, but not just because your great 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 grandpa, like had Jesus sentenced to death. I mean, that doesn't mean that you are going to have anything bad happen to you. You just share some DNA with that person. That's about it. So, yeah, okay. I guess I answered KZen's question. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui said, are there any rules for mendicants handling money mentally and verbally, such as when allocating temple donations or temple managing? Well, there really aren't any rules of monastic discipline with regard to mental acts. There are no thought crimes in Vinaya. But verbally, yeah. If you're acting physically or verbally, then you're in the realm of breaking rules. There's no Vinaya rules against thinking thoughts. Not that I can think of. So, yeah, there are rules against bhikkhus handling money verbally. Like, if you, let's say you're the abbot of a monastery. This happens all the time. You got the abbot of a monastery, and somebody will make donations, and he'll say, if he's strict, some of the ones who are trying to be strict, he'll say, give it to the copy, give it to the monastery attendant, which is already against the rules, because a monk is not allowed to tell anybody what to do with money. Unless, the only thing you're allowed to say, somebody asks you, what should I do with this money? You can say, do whatever makes you happy. That's all you're allowed to say. You can't say, give it to that person, invest it in this, none of that, especially if it's for your own benefit. So you're the abbot of a monastery. Like, I was technically senior monk abbot of a monastery in Burma, and I needed, like, let's say a bag of cement. We were going to do some little project, fix something, whatever. I need a bag of cement. I'll tell, like, a layperson who's like an attendant who I know has money for my benefit, say, I need a bag of cement. I can't say, buy me a bag of cement, because then you're telling them what to do with money, and that's the same as handling the money yourself. If a monk tells somebody what to do with money, it's the same as him doing it himself. It's breaking the exact same rule as if he's got the money in his own hand. So, if I needed something, I'd say, I need this. But I could not say, buy me this. But there are a lot of monks in Burma, probably in Asia in general, who are try to be strict, but it's just so difficult not handling money. They'll be telling the monastery attendant, go buy this. We need this. You get the money from so and so and go and buy that, and they're breaking the same rule as if they're handling the money themselves. It may be that karma-wise, it's not quite so bad, but with regard to breaking the rules, it's exactly the same rule. Nisagiya pachitiya. So it renders just about every monastery uninhabitable to a strict monk, because if a monk buys something with money, or something is bought with money that a monk donated or whatever, that a monk handled, then the whole thing is unusable for monks. Anytime you use it, you're breaking a rule. And I've already given this example before, but there's this classic example in the commentaries. You've got this shameless monk who buys a mango with his own money. He eats the mango, tosses the pit. That pit sprouts into a tree. 100 years later, a completely different monk sits down in the shade of that tree, and he is breaking a rule for making use of something that was bought with a monk's money. And almost every monastery in Burma, most monasteries in America also, you've got at least one monk donating $5 to the fund for paying the rent or building the retaining wall or building the building or whatever. That's it. The whole thing is not kosher. It is ritually unclean. So, as a relatively strict monk in Burma, I just avoided monasteries as a general rule. Let's see here. So I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to Rui's next question. This is similarly a rule about monastic discipline. I don't know why I said a book. Maybe because it's about bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Anyways, Rui says, would it be possible for a bhikkhu and a bhikkhuni, or these days a committed assistant female practitioner or renunciant, to wander together from place to place and even live under the same roof for extended periods of time? No, I mean, they would be breaking several rules by doing that. I'm getting kind of rusty on my Patimokkha rules, but I'm pretty sure that there is a rule saying that a monk and a nun, I mean, first of all, it's just against the rules to travel with a woman by arrangement. So if like a woman says, come on, venerable sir, let's go such and such place, and the monk says, okay, and they go, he's already broken a rule. So also like sitting alone with a woman, even a bhikkhuni, against the rules. Getting back to the Patimokkha rule that I'm kind of hazy on, there seems to be a rule against a monk and a nun traveling together specifically, and it says if they can ride the same boat across a river. Like they have to cross a river, there's no bridge. They are allowed by Vinaya to ride across the river in the same boat, but they can't go up the river or down the river together. Only to cross that river, they can be on the same boat together by some kind of arrangement. So the rules are very strict. Sleeping under the same roof, again, that's a Pachidya offense. So any monk and a nun, or a monk and a woman in general, traveling together, they're going to be breaking, or at least the monk is going to be breaking several rules just by doing that. So, I mean, when I was a junior monk, I actually got into some trouble. I got some scoldings because I would refuse to travel with a woman. Like sometimes the only person who can drive the car is a female, like a female monastery attendant. And I just thought, no, I'll just stay here. And sometimes I'd be invited specifically, but I still wouldn't go because, it's against the rules. And I was trying to be strict in following the rules. And there are some rules that almost nobody follows anymore. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from GameFap. And GameFap says, do you have any views on Diogenes? And I assume he's referring to Diogenes the Cynic, Diogenes of Sinopa. Let's see. So do you have any views on Diogenes? He seems to me like he would be the equivalent of a very crass Buddhist monk. And I actually wrote an essay on Diogenes and on the Cynics, like the ancient Greek Cynic philosophers in general. I can't recall if it's in any of my 3 books. Maybe it is. I mean, if anyone has read one of my books that has this essay on cynicism, the old-fashioned kind, not new-fashioned cynicism, but old-fashioned cynicism, classical cynicism, then please leave a remark in the comments pointing out, which book it's in, because otherwise it's just not online anymore. But before I became a Buddhist, Diogenes the Cynic was my hero. He was like one of my role models. And the Cynic philosophers came about as close to Buddhist monks as you're likely to find in classical Greece or Rome. I mean, there were certain differences, like monks, the Cynics were allowed to have sex, whereas obviously Buddhist monks are not allowed to have sex. They were allowed to handle money, although they didn't handle very much of it. But it was kind of similar that the whole philosophy was, in order to be happy, you have to have everything you want. And the only surefire way of having everything you want is not to want anything. So they just kept their desires down to just the level of animal maintenance, which they considered sex to be just one of the animal needs. And so there was a famous Cynic philosopher named Crates, I think. He and his wife, who was also a Cynic philosopher, just had sex in public like dogs, which is one reason why they're called Cynics, because Cynics means dogs. They were relatively shameless. Like Diogenes, I think he took a dump in public once, and according to one story, he masturbated in public. And then when people were like calling him out for it, he said, "It's too bad I can't relieve my feelings of hunger likewise by just rubbing my belly." And his shamelessness was one of the aspects of the cynical philosophers. I mean, you shouldn't be ashamed of anything that you do, especially if it's just an ordinary thing like taking a dump. Also, freedom of speech. They definitely believed in that. I think it was called parousia. Parousia. So, yeah, there's a lot that I admire with regard to the early Cynics. I mean, the Stoics were largely based on the Cynics. It's just they made it more mental and less physical. You know, it was more of an attitude with the Cynics, the Stoics, whereas the Cynics were more into walking the talk to some degree. So yeah, I definitely I have written an essay on Diogenes and the Cynics, and I don't know if it's in one of my 3 books that is published and available on Amazon. But yeah, he was my hero before I discovered Eastern philosophy, Eastern spirituality. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Outer Haven. And Outer Haven says, being a biologist, how do you feel when you see or hear the terms assigned male or female at birth? When I see the word assigned, I think of like a professor giving an assignment. This redefining is manipulative and misleading. Yeah, I mean, when I see assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, it's just politics. You know, it's like leftist politics is saying, you know, they can no longer tell the difference between men and women. I mean, it's like notoriously there was like the most recently appointed Supreme Court justice, when asked what is a woman, she refused to answer. She could not answer. She said, I'm not a biologist. So, I mean, nowadays the left cannot tell the difference between men and women because feminine sentiment has pretty much taken over the left, at least in the decadent West, and women identify more with their feelings than with their thoughts. And so whether you're man or woman is no longer a matter of pure objectivity like gonads or chromosomes. It's how do you feel? Do you feel like a man? Do you feel like a woman? But I mean, how does feeling like a woman even mean anything if they can't even say what a woman is? A woman is anyone who feels like a woman. You're just using a circular definition that it contains the word in question in the answer, in the definition. So yeah, assigned male or female at birth is just a sign of like decadence, essentially, moral decay, civilizational decay. It's like politics that can no longer a political position that can no longer tell the difference between men and women. So yeah, it's not really a biological term other than you'd be assigned male or female at birth due to your biological characteristics that are apparent to the doctor. So that is being sort of, you know, kind of they're distancing from it as much as they are able. And it happens not only in gender, but also in ethnicities and so forth. There is such a thing as human biodiversity. There is such a thing in biological terms as sexual dimorphism between men and women. And it's just Marxism and the whole idea of the blank slate and there's no human nature and Darwinism should never be applied to humans, that kind of a thing. All Marxist positions. It's just pretty much taken over, especially on the globalist left, and is I mean, they're trying to accomplish something by doing all this, but what they're accomplishing is not really positive. It's certainly not an improvement. So I guess that's what I think about it. So I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Skoladin or Skuladin, and he's got some strange questions here. I think he had some strange questions last time too. But his first question is TikTok a form of corporate meditation? And then he gives the little like bullet points to support the idea. So he says, in the essay on the origins of meditation from the book Buddhist Ethics, Buddhist Practice, I noticed that TikTok has characteristics both from the passage about gazing into the fire and shamanistic practices. And then another bullet point is trance, glassy eyes, vegetative state to keep people from going outside, Another bullet point, creates tribal culture. Another bullet point, users sing, dance, and chant in unison, which creates a kind of group mind. Yeah, I don't think they're watching TikTok videos like all together. They're all dancing while looking into their phone. Another bullet point is 30-second videos played on a loop, which turn into an obnoxious mantra. And then the last bullet point is doom scrolling. Seems like the outcome is the exact opposite of a vision quest, even if the technique is similar. No, I mean, it can be a kind of samadhi, but it's not sama samadhi. It's not right concentration. So TikTok, you could call it a form of meditation, but it's more of like a trance-inducing, stupor-inducing, time-wasting, almost debilitating phenomenon. Yeah, I mean, staring into a campfire, I gave that as a possibility for the origins of meditation, how meditation evolved, what was its progenitor, what was its ancestor. And yeah, I mean, you can stare into a TV set, which is sort of a misplaced instinct to just stare into the campfire. Staring into the campfire keeps you from wandering away from the light and getting eaten by hyenas or something. See. Yeah, I mean, it produces a kind of mild trance state, but I mean, where do you want to draw the line between meditation and just something that induces a mild trance state? Like listening to music with pounding drums and so forth, like a voodoo ceremony where it's just the rhythmic dancing and the chanting and the pounding drums just cause people to go in trance states where they're presumably, allegedly, like possessed by voodoo deities and so forth. I mean, just because it can be a meditation, it's not right meditation. So even if we say that, yeah, it could be called a kind of meditation, doom scrolling on TikTok, doom scrolling on X or whatever, it's not right meditation. It's not going to get you enlightened, obviously. In fact, it's going to take you farther away from enlightenment in most cases than to get you closer to enlightenment. So, yeah. So, I mean, it's more of a kind of corporate thought control than a kind of corporate meditation. But it depends on exactly how you define the term meditation, I guess. So I'm going to just move on to Skoladin's next question, which is, would you happen to know what the situation is in Sri Lanka? And then he's got bullet points again. From what little I heard, the government liberalized. They enacted green policies, prevented farmers from buying fertilizer, crops failed, people became hungry, overthrew the regime, and then a question mark at the end as the last bullet point. Yeah, I mean, I've heard some years ago something like that happen, that the government of Sri Lanka tried to be very liberal. They're going to try to excel the world, exceed most other nations, maybe all nations, with regard to how woke and liberal they were. And they were going to do everything they could to stop global warming. And like the fertilizer had to be like some kind of organic fertilizer that was too expensive for the farmers to use. And crops failed and people began rioting in the streets. And pretty much overthrew the government. I think the government essentially went bankrupt due to their attempts to live up to these leftist policies or globalist quasi-liberal policies. So, yeah, I mean, I've heard essentially the same thing, but I don't know what kind of situation Sri Lanka is in now. I haven't really been keeping up, and Sri Lanka just isn't in the news. Burma isn't in the news. It's like the countries you see in the news are just the countries that, the globalist establishment wants you to be concerned with for political reasons. You hear a lot about Ukraine, hear a lot about Israel. Maybe you hear about Taiwan every now and then. You hear about some certain Middle Eastern countries and so forth. But, countries that really, it's just not to the establishment's benefit for people to hear about it. They don't hear about it much. So, yeah, I guess I know essentially the same that Skuladin here knows. And so the last question from Skoladin or Skuladin is one that I don't know how he came up with this. He says, is Taylor Swift a tulpa? And I'm not even sure what a tulpa is because I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist. I'm really not well versed in Tibetan Buddhism. But is a tulpa the ones that like I was mentioning in a previous Q&A recently about, they're the ones that go out and find texts in caves and so forth? I think a tulku is like a reincarnation of some lama or something. I don't think she's one of those. So yeah, I don't know that much about Taylor Swift either, to tell you the truth. I probably know more about Sri Lanka than I know about Taylor Swift. I mean, I knew that Taylor Swift was the heartthrob of like white nationalists back before she let it slip, that she let everybody know that she was a flaming leftist, that, she looks kind of Germanic, and a lot of the Germanic types, the Germanic nationalist types, they just saw her as this dreamboat. And then she came out of the closet as a flaming leftist. It's too bad, really. So let's see here. I guess I answered that one because Taylor Swift just is not on my radar, really. I couldn't name a single song sung by Taylor Swift. So I'm just moving on to the next question, which is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, do you believe we have direct experience of time, even if there's no way to be sure that time really exists? Along with the external world, it does seem that we directly experience a form of internal time because we can feel the changing of our emotions, which are not part of the external world. Well, yeah, direct experience of time would seem to imply that time is real. And time is not ultimately real. It is conventionally real. So from a conventional point of view, you could say we have direct experience of time. But from an ultimate point of view, there is no us, and there's no us to experience anything. And there's no time from the ultimate point of view, the absolute point of view. If you can even say the absolute has a point of view, which it really doesn't. So, to experience time, you have to use memory. So you're experiencing, arguably, let's say that we can experience the present moment, like perceptually, which technically isn't true. There's always a split second lag. But let's say we can be aware of the present moment. But still, in order to be aware of the passage of time, you have to compare the present moment with some previous present moment, some previous point in time. And so you can't really know for sure that previous point in time really existed. Like Bertrand Russell pointed out one time, it's impossible to know for sure that some deity with a strange sense of humor didn't create the entire universe 5 seconds ago and implant a bunch of memories into us of things that never happened. So, from the conventional point of view, we do experience time in the form of just an ever-changing present moment. And without that, we wouldn't really be conscious in a recognizably human sense. We have to have like a linear thought going through time. Our consciousness would be radically different if we were four-dimensional beings who were just as aware of our death as our birth and everything in between, like the four-dimensional aliens of Tralfamadore, that our entire consciousness would have to operate on some different way. And just life, how would we be alive without like moving? We'd be like some frozen conscious statues or something if we experience all of time simultaneously, like Einsteinian space-time. But I am unaware of whether or not I'm actually answering this question. So, let's see. Do you believe we have direct experience of time? Yeah, I would say that from a conventional sense, like an empirical sense, we do. Man, it is a tough question because all you can really know is the present moment. So, the present moment is timeless. Each present moment is the only present moment. So it is a kind of mental construct, like Immanuel Kant was arguing, that time is a kind of mental construct. So, gosh, I guess it would depend on the meaning of direct experience. And I'm doing this Q&A later than usual. It's starting to get dark outside already. Usually I do it much earlier than this, but we had all the excitement of buying shrimps that are now like hidden and invisible in my aquarium. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm sorry I cannot answer this question any better than I just did, but I think he's going to ask a similar one coming up soon here. But he says his next question. You often say that you don't consider matter to be ultimately real. Do you consider matter to still be contingently real and part of a contingent external world, or only existent within our deluded minds? It seems difficult to differentiate things which exist in contingent conventional reality and things that don't exist at all, because both categories fall within the greater category of samsara. Yeah, well, I mean, some things that exist in contingent or conventional reality don't exist. You know, it's like, let's say Irish people firmly believe in leprechauns. And let's say, just for the sake of argument, that leprechauns don't really exist. But the people's belief in those leprechauns causes those leprechauns to be conventional truth. Their existence is conventional truth. I mean, conventional reality is just what people agree on. So, like, in the West, people who vote Democrat are living in a different conventional reality than people who vote Republican. There's becoming more and more of a rift between these two worldviews. So, I mean, ultimately, none of it's real. But I want to get to this one part of the question. Do I consider matter to still be contingently real and part of contingent external world, or only existent within our deluded minds? It goes back to my simile of the block of marble. That block of marble contains every possible statue, which could also include physical matter. It could include real, actual physical statues. But what separates them out from the block of marble is mind. You have to have mind to separate it out. And so, I mean, just physical matter can't separate itself out. You have to have some kind of recursive mind that is like self-referential in order for it to start considering itself to be separate from everything else. So whether physical matter exists or not is almost irrelevant. I mean, it's pretty much irrelevant. It's the same either way, whether you want to say it exists, but only by being perceived. Otherwise, it's just in a kind of nebulous potential form inside the formless void. Man, we're getting some deep questions this time. Let's see. So it depends on how you look at it, I guess. But, I mean, without a perceiving mind, you would not have any kind of differentiated material universe. You'd have, like, the potential for it, but you would not have the actual universe consisting of, you know, stars and planets and comets and cosmic dust and hydrogen atoms and, you know, electromagnetic radiation and all that. It just would not exist without a perceiving mind separating it out from everything else. So it's kind of in there. It's just that it cannot be differentiated or like separated from the rest of infinity without some conscious mind perceiving it. And so whether it exists without the conscious mind or not is irrelevant, really. I mean, whether there is physical matter or not is just largely irrelevant. And I sincerely hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the next one. And this is similar to the first one from Zenithoid. Do you consider time to be ultimately real? I think this is an important question to ask, because if it is ultimately real, that should mean that nirvana is permanent. Whereas if time isn't ultimately real, nirvana would be neither permanent nor impermanent, because it would have no relation to time whatsoever. Yeah, nirvana is timeless. Akaliko, timeless. But I think I already answered this question. I do not consider time to be ultimately real. It's like a mental construct. I can't remember what Immanuel Kant called it, like a category or something, that is just sort of a gimmick cooked up by the mind in order to help it process information. So, or just to help it navigate in some kind of world that it can get some kind of grasp on. So, no, I do not consider time to be ultimately real. I do not consider space to be ultimately real. Kant also considered time and space to just be mental constructs. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Kit Kat. And Kit Kat says, what are your quarrels with Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations? I overheard you making this comment on your Studies in Archaic Buddhism series. If possible, please resume to doing them with your finished fish tank. Yeah, that's possible. And by the way, I am planning on doing a video just on that fish tank, maybe tomorrow. So you're going to learn all about the ecosystem. I can't guarantee that you're going to see any shrimps, though, because they have burrowed underneath the dead leaves. And like probably their ancestors did in their natural habitat. These ones are bright blue. They're really nice looking little shrimps. And mostly people who keep an aquarium, you know, they don't have lots of dead leaves and detritus and so forth on the bottom. But I'm trying to turn this into like a biologically diverse little ecosystem. So dead leaves are pretty much necessary, and the shrimps are like now living under them. So you will see some cherry barbs and some gouramis and probably snails and certainly plants if you watch the video. If, assuming that God's willing that I record that video, which I have every intention of doing, but you never know. As Ajahn Chah would say, not sure. So anyways, getting back to Kit Kat. What are my quarrels with Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations? I really don't have quarrels with Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations. In fact, I have stated a number of times in my videos that I consider Bhikkhu Bodhi to be possibly the best translator of Pali texts into English. I consider him to be a better translator than Ajahn Thanissaro, and those being the big two lately, because Ajahn Thanissaro is too idiosyncratic and self-indulgent. Although when it comes to translating deep philosophical texts or texts about meditation, for example, Ajahn Thanissaro knows Dhamma from experience more than Bhikkhu Bodhi does. Bhikkhu Bodhi is more of a scholar, and his translation style is very kind of mainstream. He uses most of the accepted renderings for the different Pali words. But he's solid. He is a good translator, regardless of his politics. And I think I have mentioned that Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations are good, but his footnotes can be depressing, or his endnotes rather. And like a third of the book can just be his endnotes, just explaining stuff, and he'll throw in a lot of, you know, pro-bhikkhuni stuff or, you know, gender equality stuff. You know, he's definitely leans leftwards politically, and he injects some of that into his commentarial explanations. But as a translator, he's good. As a monk, maybe not so good, but as a translator, he is one of the best. So I really don't have any quarrels with his translations. Although, like, translating asawa as taint, I think he kind of missed the boat on that one. But he's just following along with just established tradition in that regard. So I'm just going to move on to Kit Kat's next question here, which is, I overheard Ajahn Nyanamoli of Hillside Hermitage, who was already mentioned in a previous question. I'll start again. I overheard Ajahn Nyanamoli of Hillside Hermitage claim that in the early Buddhist texts that the Buddha never denied the self, but accommodating oneself is a cause of dukkha. Contrary to the doctrine that there is no self, is there a difference between these two ideas? I have chosen to not really acknowledge the idea of self-view for my own personal practice, since this really is causing a degree of dukkha upon me. Perhaps your input will bring me at ease. Well, according to Orthodox tradition, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, or the mark of no self, was the Buddha's second discourse, which caused his first disciples to become fully enlightened. You will have people using kind of sophisticated arguments to say, well, he's just saying the five khandhas are not self, which leaves the door open to something beyond the five khandhas. Although in other suttas he denies that there is anything beyond the five khandhas. He calls the five khandhas the all. That is samsara, is the five khandhas. Let's see. Now, Ajahn Yanamoli of Hillside Hermitage claimed that in the early Buddhist texts that the Buddha never denied the self, but accommodating oneself is a cause of dukkha. I'm not sure what accommodating oneself means. It's just got too many syllables in it, I guess. But, I mean, in the Atthaka Vagga, which, again, I consider to be one of the most ancient, archaic fragments of Buddhist teaching still in existence, it does claim that the source of all suffering, the source of all delusion, is the conceit, I am. So Buddhists can say, well, there is a self, but you can't identify with that self because that is the root of all delusion and suffering. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what accommodating oneself means, other than just like catering to oneself. Yeah, I'm not sure. But like in the Atthaka Vagga, it says you shouldn't believe anything. You shouldn't believe that you do have a self. You shouldn't even believe that you don't have a self. Because, I mean, beliefs are just invalid. They're those extraneous defilements that were mentioned with regard to an earlier question. That your thoughts are extraneous. Your beliefs are just like extraneous defilements. So just get rid of all beliefs. Don't identify with anything. And I mean, how could there still be a self? The whole self is a perceptual construct. So, yeah, I mean, probably your best bet is don't believe that you do have a self and don't believe that you don't have a self. Just don't even go there. Have no self-regard. Because the conceit, I am, is the root of all delusion and suffering, according to the Atthaka Vagga. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Drunk Druck. And Drunk Druck says, why do some Christians have a problem with yoga techniques? They seem to think it's satanic, but it's just stretching at the end of the day. Seems like hysteria to me. Well, it seems more like xenophobia to me. That it's just sort of like fear and distrust of the unknown and unfamiliar. So Christians, of course, most Christians think that Christianity is the one true religion. That other religions are false religions. You're going to go to hell for following those. But if you're a Christian, or maybe just a certain sect of Christian, then you're pretty much going to heaven. And they can admit that other religions will overlap with Christianity to some degree. Pretty much all religions say don't tell lies, don't steal, don't murder people, that kind of a thing. But yoga is not overlapping with Christianity at all. It's just totally alien or foreign to Christianity. And so from these people's point of view, it's something foreign and alien to genuine religion, which makes it like satanic. Like I mentioned before, there was somebody in a Breitbart comment section who was saying that Buddhists will contort their body into weird shapes to make it easier for them to be possessed by demons, and that reciting mantras is really just reciting the names of these demons to call them, and then you contort yourself so that they can enter into your body more easily. And some ignorant fanatical minister may have actually preached this at a Sunday church meeting or something, and then this person just believed it. But yeah, I mean, it's just so foreign and alien to what they consider to be true religion that they just can't see it as true religion, and so it has to be something that's diabolical. That's how I see it. It's essentially a kind of xenophobia. So I'll move on to Drunk Druck's second question, which is kind of a strange one. Have you ever managed to put yourself into a Zen-like trance? Any advice to beginners? Well, I mean, Zen is really not very trance-like. I mean, my understanding of Zen is, I mean, you're cultivating wide awakeness. I've never heard of a Zen-like trance. I mean, maybe some people who think that they're practicing Zazen and are just like hypnotizing themselves or something may go into a trance, but that's not genuine Zen. I mean, in Theravada and like in Hinduism, you can have a meditator who goes into this deep state where he's just oblivious to everything going on around him. You know, you could be kicking him and he wouldn't feel it. He wouldn't know anything. And I mean, I'm skeptical of that kind of meditation because you're supposed to be becoming more awake, not become like a hibernating squirrel. But in Zen, I never even heard of that. I mean, you're working on a koan, especially if you're into Rinzai Zen, or you're doing like Shikantaza, where you're just in this state of like enhanced awareness, just observing your own mind carefully. So, yeah, I'm not even sure what a Zen-like trance would be. I mean, I've never gone into like the hibernating squirrel kind of trance state where you're just oblivious to everything around you. I do not think that would be purity of mindfulness, for example. So I've always considered a deep meditative state to be an enhanced consciousness. You're more awake, you're more conscious than when you're walking around making noise. So, yeah, this is just kind of a weird, like a curveball or knuckleball kind of a question, because, yeah, I've never managed to put myself into a Zen-like trance because, I mean, I don't even know what a Zen-like trance would be. But advice for beginners, I mean, my advice to beginners is don't try to cultivate trance states. Don't meditate in such a way that you no longer hear the ticking of the clock. You don't feel the mosquito biting your arm. You're just like blotto. I mean, you're just oblivious to the outside world. It may be some meditation master can give you good reasons why you should cultivate something like that. But as a general rule, you're trying to be more awake, more aware, and not go into a trance state. Most trance states that people cultivate are like self-hypnosis, which may be samadhi, but I don't think it's sama samadhi. Just like doom scrolling on TikTok is not sama samadhi. I mean, if you are going to hypnotize yourself, you should at least know that you're hypnotizing yourself and not that you're attaining jhana or some such. So my advice to beginners is, find a good meditation method that you can make progress with and just keep going with that meditation method. And whatever happens, especially if you're trying to practice mindfulness, don't attribute any significance to whatever arises. Any kind of weird fireworks, bells and whistles, hearing voices, seeing images and all that, just note it and let it go. You know, it's just, you shouldn't be clinging to this stuff. It'll derail your meditation, just for starters. So just whatever arises, just note it and let it go. Remain very awake and just be very observant. Anything that arises into your awareness, note it and let it go. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from the Freedom Conversation. And I have noticed we've got a few new people asking questions, in addition to some older people who just changed their name a lot. I'm assuming that the Freedom Conversation is a new person and not an older person who just changed his name to the Freedom Conversation. So welcome aboard. Ahoy, matey. And the Freedom Conversation says, why do New Age spiritualists say Buddhism is a form of mass formation psychosis to my face? And I'm not sure what mass formation psychosis is. Would it be like mass hysteria, or just everybody believing in something so that it seems real? I think that New Age spiritualists are more prone to that than Buddhists are. I mean, New Age spiritualists can believe damn near anything. Before I was a monk, I tended to I just keep a safe distance from New Age people because the softness of their head, their ability to believe damn near anything, it just kind of bothered me. I just felt uncomfortable around it. They could use just the most weirdest attempts at logic to justify stuff, or they just have all these glaring inconsistencies. Like, for example, let's see, they're quite okay with everything's just a mental construct until it gets to diet. And then it's just absolutely for sure that if you're going to eat sugar, it's going to give you gout because of this and that and this interaction. And it's like, yeah, I shouldn't continue in this vein. But when I came back to America in 2011, at least half the people that were supporting me were new age people, and I got more of an appreciation just because they were very open-minded, because they're capable of believing damn near anything. So that makes them open-minded and very accepting as a general rule. And they were very just open-hearted, generous people. So I could appreciate that. When they were supporting me, then I found a new appreciation for New Age spiritualists. But still, trying to listen to a conversation of New Age people discussing spirituality, you start getting vertigo and just wanting to rush from the room within a few minutes. So, yeah, I wouldn't take what New Age spiritualists say Buddhism is very seriously. If you're a Buddhist, you probably understand Buddhism better than New Age spiritualists. Most of them understand Buddhism. A form of mass formation psychosis. If that's just the idea that people believing in something creates like a false reality, that applies to everything. It applies to all religions. It applies to science. It applies to politics. It applies to just everyday life. But if it doesn't mean that, if a mass formation psychosis is different from that, then I'm not sure what it is. But even if Buddhism is a form of mass formation psychosis, it is a benevolent and relatively benign form of mass formation psychosis, the purpose of which is gradually to allow you to escape, to get, to go beyond the mass formation psychosis. So it may be that of necessity, because we're unenlightened, we're stuck in a mass formation psychosis, whatever that exactly is supposed to be. But Buddhism has this gimmick of, you deal with this and then you just gradually detach from it. So you cure yourself of it. But I do think that pretty much everybody is psychotic from a Buddhist point of view, unless you're fully enlightened. So that aspect of it is unavoidable. You have to start off with the psychosis, or like there was some Mahayana text that I read long ago that said the purpose of Lord Buddha's teaching is to liberate us from our thinking by means of our thinking. So to liberate us from our psychosis by means of this Buddhist mass formation psychosis. Fighting fire with fire, so to speak. So, yeah, I think New Age spiritualism is also a kind of mass formation psychosis, or a very nebulous conglomeration. I said conglomeration of mass formation psychoses. Because really, trying to discuss philosophy with a New Age person, man, I assume some of them are capable of doing a creditable job, but I don't think I've ever encountered one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Frederick, who changes his name every few weeks, it seems like. Now he's Frederick. And Frederick says, if karma is not some cosmic force, but our own intention or mental state, and nobody wants to go to hell, why some people go to hell? And this is a good question. And I was thinking I could just do an entire video just talking about this one subject. So why is it that our karma is like our own mental states, but yet our own karma can send us to hell when nobody wants to go to hell? Well, there's different ways of discussing this, different ways of approaching it. One is, I'll just give a common example that most people can relate to, and that is that dreams at night. I think most of us nowadays agree that we are creating our own dreams. It's our own mind is generating dreams. People nowadays generally no longer believe that dreams are implanted into us by a god. So we are creating our own dreams, but still sometimes we create nightmares. We create bad dreams where some monster or some murderer is chasing us through like an airport. And when we try to run away, it's like we're running through syrup. We can't get away. And then right when he jumps on you, that's when you jolt awake or something. So, I mean, if nobody wants nightmares, why are we creating nightmares for ourselves? Nobody wants weird, creepy dreams that we don't like, but we're creating them ourselves, subjecting ourselves to these weird, creepy dreams. So, I think one important thing to remember is that the mental states that are generating karma and generating the fruition of karma, it's not our superficial thinking ego. It's a different level of consciousness. And that's something that's really hard for people to understand, especially in the West, maybe, where we're just very egocentric. We just think that our conscious thinking mind is just all the mind we've got. Maybe we can accept that there is a little bit of subconscious stuff below the surface, but for the most part, if it's part of our mind, we should be aware of it as a general rule, and it doesn't work that way at all. There's just different levels of mind and most of those levels, the superficial ego, the thinking mind, is oblivious to it. So at deeper levels, we might have a different agenda than your superficial thinking ego. Like, there's a statement that Ram Dass makes in one of his books. This is more of a Hindu concept. I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but he'll say that after somebody dies, they go into kind of like a bardo realm. They can like review their past life, and this is like a higher level of consciousness. This isn't like the personality of the person who just died. This is like the deeper levels of mind that were always there and are no longer obscured because that personality is now dead. It's just like a mask that has fallen away, and now you're like at this other level of consciousness. And so this other level of consciousness sort of kind of looks at the options and thinks, well, what I need for my spiritual development is to be born into a ghetto and become a drug addicted prostitute who is knifed to death in a back alley at the age of 18. Okay, here we go. And down into the body they go. And like I say, that's more of a Hindu idea, but it's like other levels of your consciousness may not have the same values, the same agendas. They might be willing to play a role in a tragedy instead of just doing comedies all the time. So there is that. But another more Buddhist approach to why it is that we make bad karma that sends us to hell, even though it's our own creation of our own mind, is like someone who's not very good at driving a car. They don't want to get in a wreck, but even so, their own actions cause them to get in a wreck because they are not skillful. And like good karma is technically kusala, which means skillful. It's not good karma and bad karma in Buddhist philosophy. It's skillful and unskillful. So when you act unskillfully, you wreck your car or you wind up in hell through your own actions. You may not have wanted to go there, but you're just incompetent at steering the vehicle. So there's different ways of explaining it, but the main thing to remember is that the generation of karma, for the most part, is happening at a different level of consciousness than the thinking mind. And Theravada Buddhism really doesn't have much of a concept of different levels of consciousness or a subconscious or superconscious or anything, but still it's pretty clear that that is the case. And what some people consider to be their soul is just a deeper level of their consciousness that may survive death and remains, fairly similar from one life to the next. But again, that's not Orthodox Buddhism. That would be more like Hinduism or something. So, yeah. So I guess the two main things to bear in mind. One, it's a different level of consciousness that may have very different values, very different priorities. And also, most people are just incompetent at steering the vehicle. They're just going to go off the road, even though they don't want to go off the road. It's their own actions that are driving them off the road because they are unskillful. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is a heartfelt question, it seems. This is from Sam Papalapa, who I think used to be called Indian Guy, sometimes known as Trevor. I think. And if Sam Papalapa isn't Trevor, then forgive me for making an honest mistake. So anyway, Sam Papalapa says, all I think about is renunciation and dream of becoming a monk as soon as possible. I'm not that smart and I have many blemishes that make fear arise, but it's not something I can't change. Since the Dhamma has helped me change more than anything else so far, then it must be what I should do to cure my defilements, etc. I can't wait till I have enough money to renounce the world. I can't wait to be good enough to renounce the world. I feel like I can't wait any longer, to be honest. My question is, if one is having this much mental proliferation about renouncing the world and going for full enlightenment, then do you recommend I go and become ordained immediately? All I think about is Buddhism in one way or another. I know I must get rid of that craving too eventually, but it's crazy how obsessed I am with the Dhamma. Well, it's kind of strange up here when he says, let's see, I can't wait till I have enough money to renounce the world. Well, really renouncing the world doesn't cost anything. So, I mean, that's good. I mean, when I went to the monastery, I donated, I can't remember exactly how much it was. I think it was like $7,000 plus my pickup truck to the monastery. And that was the best I could do. That's what I had. I donated that as just sort of like to help defray the costs of feeding me. And, but as it turns out, I was ordained at a Burmese monastery in America, Tongpulu Kaba'i Monastery. And the Burmese are so generous and so supportive of monks that almost immediately I had sponsors, like people just very eager to support me. So getting support really shouldn't be that difficult so long as you can find an appropriate place to be ordained. And if you wanted to go to Asia, then of course you'd have to come up with the money for plane tickets and, settle all of your affairs before going. You have to pay off all your debts if you're in debt. That no monk should be ordained if he's in debt. Let's see. So, yeah, I mean, if you could find a suitable monastery in America that would take you, maybe you could serve as a monastery attendant for several months, maybe a year or something, until you think that you're purified enough and you've done your part to support the monastery enough that then they can start supporting you as a monk. Then that can work too. It's something you'll have to look into, though. I wouldn't recommend trying to be ordained where I was ordained, because that place has pretty much gone belly up. Let's see. I can't wait till I have enough money to renounce the world. I can't wait to be good enough to renounce the world. Well, I mean, I had those same kind of thoughts. Like when I first was checking into the monastery where I eventually ordained, I wrote about how, I was, kind of unworthy. I just felt kind of unworthy of becoming a monk. And the monastery attendant who wrote back to me said, it's like every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. So, I mean, just the fact that you become a monk, or you go to the monastery in good faith, as an attendant at first, a pakao or whatever, dressed in white or whatever, supporting the monks. I mean, that's a pretty good indication that you're above average. You're at the right end of the bell-shaped curve already. So, yeah, I mean, if you really feel like you should renounce the world as soon as possible, I'm sure it could be done. I mean, first you have to find, you can't just wander. Maybe you can, but as a general rule, you don't just take off wandering like people could do in India. Maybe they still can do that in India, where you just, get yourself a robe and just start walking, maybe with a bowl or something. But in America, it generally works better if you can find a supportive community, like a monastery, ashram. Assume if, as a Theravada Buddhist, you'd go to a monastery. There's like Asian-run monasteries, and then there's Western-run monasteries. The Western-run monasteries, on average, are more serious. You've got sort of a more serious, more dedicated level of monks there. And you could just ask them, I mean, how could I become a monk here? I mean, I'm willing to donate what I've got to the monastery, and willing to serve as a monastery attendant on the condition that I get ordained, at some point in the not too distant future. So, I mean, if you really want to renounce the world, I mean, you can. There's nothing really stopping you unless you're in debt. And then in which case, like you got student loan debt or something, you got to pay that off or somehow get it annulled so that you don't owe it anymore. And then you can renounce the world. So, but I really don't think that it would be that difficult. You just find a place that with a teacher that you respect and trust, and I'm sure that the two of you could work it out. So, good luck to you. And then the next question is, did you have to pay to become a monk? And I already answered that question. I voluntarily donated like $7,000 from my savings account and my pickup truck. And then almost immediately upon being ordained, I had just like Burmese lay people that were just overjoyed to be supporting me. And if you're a serious monk, like very conscientious and sincere, then they'll be all the more happy and willing. I mean, if you protect Dhamma, Dhamma protects you. And if you really have a calling to renounce the world, then the world is going to help you renounce the world. So, yeah, I don't think you've got anything to worry about there. So, I guess I'll move on to the next question. This is from Pyramid. And Pyramid says, you've been doing these Q&As for a pretty long time, I see. Do you ever get tired or annoyed of having to answer so many questions over and over again? No, not really. I mean, it is true that I get asked the same question, repeatedly sometimes. But it just indicates that people really are interested in an answer to that question. So I've got no objection to answering the same question more than once. The only thing that kind of bugs me, I think, is Western Buddhists who just assume that scientific materialism is the truth. And then they're trying to like fit or superimpose Dhamma onto scientific materialism or scientism, scientific realism. That, I mean, it kind of, I don't know, it kind of bugs me a little bit when people just keep doing this, especially if it's just like one person is like sort of continually hitting it from different angles. Another kind of question is about karma. Is such and such an action good karma or bad karma? It's, I have to give the same answer over and over again. It's like physical actions are morally neutral. It's the mental states that accompany the physical actions that really are making the karma. So, I mean, every once in a while I might get a little impatient with that kind of question, but still I try to answer them patiently and, in good faith. People ask a question in good faith. I'm willing to answer the question in good faith as well as I can. So I'm just going to move on to Pyramid's next question, which is, are there questions you come across and just roll your eyes and ignore? I see in previous videos you've answered obvious troll questions from Tig about pogs and whether you've had intercourse while wearing the fez. Actually, I think it was somebody else asked me the fez question, but Tig does ask like deliberately irreverent, off the wall kind of questions sometimes. And usually I'll answer those. I mean, sometimes the main kind of questions I won't answer. Some questions are just rhetorical, or sometimes there's a fellow named Fred, bless his heart, who just kind of throws question marks in for no apparent reason into a comment. So it's hard for me to tell if he really is expecting an answer or not. And then, of course, there's just like they're rare, but every once in a while you'll just get some kind of a snotty question that's asked not in good faith. So, I mean, sometimes I'll even answer those. But I mean, if it's just, they're just being snotty by asking the question, then it is my prerogative to just skip that question. But as a general rule, it's all fair game. And usually, even like troll questions or like sarcastic kind of questions, I can still answer those. But I prefer questions in good faith, about something that you really want to know about. And so we are at the very last question. Boom! It always takes me by surprise. And this is from Extremely Rare Bird. An Extremely Rare Bird says, how did you wash your bowl as a cave-dwelling monk? Well, I still have my bowl right back there under the fez. And how did I wash it? Well, it depends on where I was. Like, usually if I'm staying in a monastery, like the one place I lived longer than anywhere else, there was a cave there, but it was on the outskirts of a monastery. And so I would just carry buckets of water up from the well. I lived up on the side of a hill, just like a 4-minute walk down the hill would take you to the bathhouse and a well and like the congregation hall. And you walk another couple minutes and you're at the Chinduin River. So I would just carry buckets of water up the hill to my cave, and then I'd have like clay pots. I had one clay pot just for bowl washing water. I'd keep that with water in it. And one of the things that villagers would donate quite a lot of is detergent powder. So I have this little bag of detergent powder, and I have this clay bowl with water in it. And so I just rinse my bowl out. First you just pour in a cup of water and swirl it around and throw that so that you're getting rid of all the extra rice grains and so forth. And you put in a little detergent powder and pour in some more water and swish it around, and then you throw that out, and then you rinse it a few times until the detergent powder is washed away. There you go. You got a clean bowl, and then you set it in the sun. It's a rule of monastic discipline that after you wash your bowl, you have to set the bowl in the sun to dry. You can't set it out there for too long. That'll ruin the black coating on it. And that's a rule that probably most monks are unaware of. And so that's generally how I wash my bowl. Although when I was living like on the outskirts of Alando Katapa National Park, after I would eat, I would just go down to the creek, Patolon Chaon, and do water things. So every day after I finished my meal, I'd go down to this creek and wash my bowl at the creek. So I didn't have a clay pot, but I still had the detergent powder. And I just wash it down there and do other water things like brush my teeth and take a bath and so forth, fill my drinking water bottles, and then just go back up to my cave again. Or sometimes the one year that I spent the rainy season there, you couldn't really go down and take a bath in the creek. You couldn't drink the creek water because it was just like flood waters. It was all muddy and you get the squirts if you drink the water. So then I would dig a hole in the sand near a body of water and then let it fill up, and you bail that out, and let it fill up and you bail that out until it's coming up clear. The sand acts as a water filter, and then you can just wash your bowl there. I did know a monk who lived in Burma, who he didn't even use detergent powder. He would have these soap berries that he had. There was a bush at the monastery, I guess. I'm not sure if I ever saw the bush or not, but it was a soapberry bush, and it grew these fruits like this, and he would have them dried, and you just put them in water and you swish them around and it turns into soapy water. So you could wash your bowl without the detergent powder just by using soap berries, which is kind of strange, but there we are. And that's the last question. That's how I washed my bowl as a quick cave-dwelling monk. So if you got any questions that you think I can answer, especially if they're in good faith, not sarcastic or snotty, although I might answer them anyway, for entertainment value at least, then include them in the comments below, or if you have access to the Subscribe Star channel, you can ask them there. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. And whatever you think I'm able to answer. I'm really not much into like Tibetan Buddhism, and really not even heavily into specifically Thai Theravada Buddhism, but Theravada Buddhism in general, Burmese Buddhism certainly, meditation, philosophy, including Western philosophy, me personally, Aberdeen, Washington, questions like that I can generally answer fairly well. And look at the URL links below to see where you can find me online and find my books on Amazon, and be happy.